Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast. I'm Robert Bryce. On this podcast, we talk about energy, power, innovation, and politics. And I'm pleased to welcome back for the fourth time my friend Isaac Orr. He is a policy fellow at the Center of the American Experiment. Isaac, welcome back to the Power Hungry Podcast.
Hey, Robert, thanks for having me. Always a great time to be here.
Good, good. Well, you've been on the podcast before, so you know the drill. Guests introduce themselves. So I've given your title, but please tell us who you are.
Yeah, I'm Isaac Orr. I work at Center of the American Experiment. It's a Minnesota-based think tank. My colleague Mitch Rolling and I have done, basically, we've developed a model that allows us to calculate the cost of different energy policies, right? So whether that's an EPA regulation or a state regulation or state law, right, rather, we're able to say, okay, well, if you're going to rely on this much wind, solar, or battery storage, or conversely, if you do the smart thing and build nuclear instead, this is what it would cost to decarbonize your system. So we've had a lot of clients this year. We've been working a lot with the North Dakota Transmission Authority, but we also work with industry stakeholders, other think tanks. So we've basically become a modeling firm for the center right, and it's been a lot of fun over the last year.
Well, so there's a lot to talk about here, and let me start there though, because you now characterize what you're doing as as a modeling firm that within the Center of the American Experiment, and you and I worked together a little bit. We were on the same podium a couple of years ago for a project that I did for the center on the resistance to wind and solar across the U.S. and documenting that, and was one of the reasons why I started publishing the Renewable Rejection Database was because of the Center for the American Experiment. But let me talk about that, because we hear about models and, we see models when it comes to climate change and a lot of discussions about well, I'll ask the question, what makes a good model? How do you know your model is reliable?
Well, all models are wrong. Some models are useful, right? And I
garbage in, garbage out. Is that?
Well, that's the thing. That's the thing, Robert. There's a lot of models out there that are promoting wind and solar that are lots of garbage in, so you get lots of garbage out, right? And I love how you call them spreadsheet jockeys.
Right.
Mitch and I joke about that. Like, how's the jockeying going today, Mitch? And he's like, oh, it's pretty good. But what we try to do is we try to say, this is the system that we have today. And then this is what's going to happen if we make this change, that change, or this change. So one of the things that we inevitably see whenever we hear claims that wind and solar will bring down costs, or they're somehow the lowest cost of energy or the most affordable portfolio, it's always a bait and switch baseline. So it's a BS baseline analysis. So it's like when the federal government says that they're cutting spending, right? Well, they never actually cut spending. They just don't spend as much as they said they were going to, right? So like, let's say, Congress says we're going to spend $2 billion or $2 trillion. And, the conservatives say, no, we're only going to spend 1.5. And then everyone cries that they've cut spending by 500 billion, right? When really nothing got cut, it all got added. So the utilities play that same game. The EPA plays that same game. States play that same game whenever they do their modeling. So ultimately, what we want to do is we want to establish, this is where we are today. We use FERC Form 1 data. So we go through, we see what each power plant in a system it costs to generate electricity. And you can use the Form 1 data for that. And we say, this is the real baseline. We're not going to use some bait and switch tactic where we, artificially make our system look better. So I think that really distinguishes us from a lot of these other models that are like overly optimistic about wind and solar. We also use realistic or the most recent capital costs that have been announced from the Energy Information Administration. A lot of times these wind and solar are the cheapest forms of energy. Studies assume that the 80% cost decline that occurred from like 2009 until today for solar, for example, will continue to be another 80% cost decline in the future, when realistically, we're seeing capital costs for solar and wind increase due to inflation. And, the other thing is, wind and solar are very capital intensive, and you have to spend that money up front, right? It's not a pay as you go system with fuel. So as interest rates increase, you're actually baking in higher costs if you are going to be building wind and solar. So a lot of those trends are reversing. Mitch and I did a piece recently where we said,
the trends, I'm sorry to interrupt, but the trends in the cost reductions you're talking about specifically here, that those are reversing, and that is largely a function of the higher interest rates.
That and just material costs, right,
Right.
Robert?
Yeah.
Steel, concrete. I mean, I think 70% of a wind turbine is the concrete base, right? So when you have an increase in concrete and the other main component is steel, the price goes up.
Right.
So yeah, we don't need to get into all the nuts and bolts of the modeling, but if anybody has questions, comments, or scathing rebuttal for the way that we do it, check out the appendices. Send us an email, and we'll be happy to chat with any of your listeners about that.
So have you had much in terms of, I mean, honest and real serious debate? I want to get into, just preface this
Yeah.
because you've done a calculation, some calculations on what the EPA's proposed greenhouse gas rule could mean in terms of cost for MISO, the mid continent independent system operator. And Minnesota is in MISO, right? And I think actually part of Texas is in MISO, if I'm not mistaken. I know part with a very small piece in SPP, I think a very small piece in MISO. So I want to talk about that, what you've calculated there, as well as what the potential costs are in Colorado. But talk about that further. What you were discussing about those, the issue of the model itself that you created. Have you had much honest, a real serious debate with people on the other side, or what I'd say the left, or the people pushing renewables saying, "Oh no, your model's wrong"? Have you had any serious engagement on that?
Yeah, we had a good back and forth with Jesse Jenkins when we released our 100% carbon-free Minnesota report. He didn't like some of our assumptions. I don't remember what they were now. He thought that we were extrapolating Minnesota's hourly wind generation to the entire MISO footprint, when realistically, that's not what we were doing. We were taking the entire MISO footprint and saying this is how effective Minnesota's wind turbines are going to be, which is overly generous to Minnesota, because the wind turbines blow better in North Dakota and South Dakota and Iowa. And that's why you're seeing a lot of the, wind that is serving Minnesota markets is being built in the Dakotas. So,
Uh-huh.
so we had some back and forth like that, but I felt like we were able to defend it really well. So most people don't mess with us because they know we're going to come with receipts. So but whenever people do, it always makes the product better. So we're always open to that kind of critique because iron sharpens iron in that respect.
So how long I know you've been at this for a while in terms of, I would guess, I mean, how would I typify that? I'd say you and Mitch together have created trying to create an open and transparent model that it shows what the potential impacts of different energy policies are. Is there anyone else doing this in the same way that you are?
There's a lot of groups on the left, right? I mean, you can basically you can more than you can shake a stick at. On the right, it's not really. There's a few consulting firms like Energy Ventures Analysis and NERA Economic Consulting. Those are the two that come to mind. But other than that, like in the nonprofit space, not really, Robert. I think that we're kind of in our own lane on that, which is really cool because we have it all to ourselves, and that allows us to do a lot of different projects all over the country. But on the left, you've got Rocky Mountain Institute. I don't know. I forget energy
Oh,
innovation. Like
right. Energy
there's
innovation.
way
Yeah.
too
Right.
many. Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
So yeah.
But I would typify those outfits, and speaking broadly, those are advocacy groups, right? They're nonprofits, right? But they are advocating for, these claims. Oh no, this is going to be cheaper. I mean, what is Amory Levin's line? No, that, renewables aren't just cheaper. This is a lunch you get paid. It's not just a free lunch. It's a lunch you get paid to eat, right? That's one of his lines, right? That this is going to be, it's going to make you thinner, right? This is part of the promise. So how many, you've done some modeling on the EPA rules on potential impact on MISO. You've done Colorado. What other states have you done the modeling on?
Yeah, so we've done 11 total. So we've done Arizona, West Virginia, Washington, Colorado, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, North Carolina, Virginia, and I'm missing two, but your listeners will hopefully forgive me for that.
So Michigan, let's talk about that. I don't know if you have the numbers at hand, but the governor there just implemented and the legislature just passed a clean electricity or zero carbon electricity mandate by, I think it was 2045. They also passed a provision that allows the state to Bigfoot local communities that will give legislators in Lansing the ability to override local zoning when it comes to wind and solar projects. Do you have those numbers at hand? Because I've been in Minnesota, I've been in Michigan. In fact, I was in Ida Township in April and met with local people fighting a solar project. I'm putting you on the spot here, but do you have those numbers? What the Michigan cost would be?
Yeah, if you vamp for a minute longer,
Yeah.
I can get those because we
Okay.
did the modeling for the Mackinac Center for Public Policy. So anyone who's interested in, reading more about that can go to Mackinac Center website, or Jason Hayes has a Substack. He's their energy policy researcher there, and his is called Forest Fuels and Freedom. So I'm
Right.
just strolling through his Substack at the moment. But yeah, it's
Yeah.
hundreds of billions of dollars, Robert.
So well, then, since vamp, I can vamp, you know me. My guest is my friend Isaac Orr. He's a policy fellow at the Center of the American Experiment in Wayzata, Minnesota, if I'm remembering correctly. No, Golden something. What's the name of the town? What is it?
It's Golden Valley, but it's a
Golden
suburb
Valley,
of,
Minnesota, but it's really Minneapolis. We'll just say that.
yes. Yeah.
He's on Twitter at the fracking guy, or you can find out more about him at americanexperiment.org. So you've done now 11 states, you've done the EPA model, and I want to come back to the EPA discussion because that is one of the proposed rule, which came out earlier this year. I believe it was in May. They have since extended the comment period on that, but it is a narrowly focused extension of the comments. So it appears that the EPA is going to go forward with this effort to try and cut CO2 emissions from the utility sector by something like 90%. It's a drastic drastic proposal that's coming not from Congress, but from the administrative state again. So did you find the Michigan numbers?
I didn't, but let's move on to the
Yeah.
EPA, right? I
Okay,
think
sure.
that's the more interesting thing.
No problem. So you recently did, I think it was in August, you and Mitch released a report. And one of the, I'll cut down to the punchline here. You said that the costs will be 246 billion. This is from the EPA's proposed greenhouse gas rule, result in additional costs for ratepayers in MISO of $246 billion, which is 7.7 billion in annual compliance costs for the MISO region alone. And that is through 7.7 billion through 2045 or 2040. Is that right?
Yes.
I think that's right. Yeah. So these are massive costs over a massive area. The MISO district or MISO segment of the U.S. grid is enormous. So how did you get to those 246 billion? What are the biggest components of that in terms of extra cost?
Yeah. I mean, I think I want to just hit on, like, the most important thing that we did for modeling the EPA's proposed carbon rule is look at the reliability of the model, or
Right.
of the proposal, right? EPA did not do this. So EPA said, okay, well, we have this assumption that the post IRA base case is going to be responsible for 99% of the emissions reductions and changes on the grid. So they just think all the subsidies in the IRA are going to lead to this fundamental transformation of the electric grid, and only the last 1% of emissions reductions will be due to the EPA carbon rules, right? So 99% IRA, one eensy beensy little bit for the carbon rules. And that's why they were able to artificially suppress the publicized cost of those regulations, right? So it was a bait and switch baseline, Robert. So what we did is we said, okay, well, and then EPA said, well, we're not going to look at the reliability of it, but we'll look at the resource adequacy of this little piece compared to our post IRA base case. So
May I interrupt for
yeah,
just a second?
yeah,
Because you hit on
absolutely.
something here that I think is absolutely essential. And it's one that I keep coming back to in my own work and also on my own Substack. I wrote about the issue of the gas system in New York City almost failing. Well, what happened? In the retrospect, no one's responsible for the reliability of the natural gas system. And the same is true with the U.S. grid as a whole. There is no one entity that says, oh, you've got to do this for reliability. But this reliability part is the one that I think could very well come back to haunt us because there is no real focus on this issue of reliability of electricity around the country. And I think it's extremely dangerous. But so EPA says their focus is on emissions reduction and not on the reliability of our most important energy network. Is that a fair way to say that? Rephrase what you're saying?
That is 100% correct, Robert. So, and it gets worse, right?
Oh,
So,
good. Oh, good.
yeah, but wait, there's more.
But wait, there's more. We're from the government. We're here to help.
That's right. That's right. those are not terrifying words either,
Yeah,
if you're in the administration. So,
right.
okay, so what happens in the EPA's regulatory impact analysis, right? That's the long document that they have to produce justifying their rules. So, in that regulatory impact analysis, whenever EPA was closing down coal plants due to the carbon rule, they would build about the same amount in natural gas plants in order to maintain the resource adequacy of their proposal, right? So, okay, that's all well and good. Whenever you shut down a coal plant, you should have to build a gigawatt of gas, right? You shut down a gigawatt of coal, replace it with gas. That's sensible. But the problem is EPA never did a resource adequacy or reliability analysis on their base case, right? So what EPA effectively did was the regulatory equivalent of making sure that the top floor of a 100-story building was structurally sound without doing the same thing for the preceding 99 floors, right? So top floor looks great. Other 99 floors, hope it's legit, is basically the way that we talk about this and when we discuss these rules, right? So what Mitch and I did, and Mitch carried a lot of the water, so you should have him on the show sometime just to give the listeners a break from me.
Sure.
So we said, okay, here's what the EPA thinks will be in the MISO system, right? So they go through and they say each of the regions in MISO will have X megawatts of this, X megawatts of that, right? So we plotted all of that out and we said, okay, so EPA thinks that there's going to be a huge increase in the amount of installed capacity on the grid as a result of these rules. MISO would effectively go from about a few hundred gigawatts of installed capacity, 204 gigawatts of installed capacity as of 2021, right? So that's what's the steel in the ground, to 457 gigawatts of installed capacity by 2055. But almost all of that is going to be wind, solar, and battery storage, and they're going to be retiring the coal, and they assume the nuclear plants close down too. So EPA makes some very like crazy assumptions of this. So all of these things are all of the graphs that I'm going to be talking about are available on americanexperiment.org. And Mitch and I started a Substack. It's Energy Bad Boys. So check that out. There's an article that we wrote for Thinking Minnesota, which is the magazine that we produce at Center of the American Experiment, called Enjoy the Blackouts, Jack. Because that's what it is. So we said, okay, there's
But
all
just
this.
to but just to
Yeah.
repeat here, so what you just the numbers you just ran through again, what if when I read your summary of the MISO report and also what you're talking about in Colorado, which we'll get to in just a minute, the key here in terms of the cost, as I see it, as what you're reading, what I'm reading back to you, is that the costs increase dramatically because of the amount of overbuilding on the system that has to occur. So you're saying that in MISO the capacity would more than double to meet the demand, to meet this model or these claims that the EPA is making. You talked about the same thing in Colorado, that this is the fundamental, if I'm reading back correctly, with all of these renewable plans, these all renewable heavy plans, it's all about a massive, massive construction project that will result in huge overbuilding of the grid in order to compensate for the unreliability or the weather dependence of wind and solar. Is that fair?
That's exactly what we did in Colorado. It's a little bit more nuanced for the EPA rules, and I'll get into that. But
Okay.
so what we did is we said this is the grid that EPA thinks will exist in 2028, 2030, 35, 40, and so on, right?
Right.
We said, what if we have the same wind and solar capacity factors in the future that we had in 2019, 2020, 21, and 22,
Right.
right? So what we do is we go through the MISO data and you can find the hourly fluctuation in wind and solar, and we divide that by the amount of installed capacity on the system. And that gives you the productivity of wind and solar during those times. So we took the MISO grid that EPA thinks will exist in the future, and we said, can this work? Can this provide electricity 8760, right? Based on past, weather conditions, if you're going to just say the phrase weather as a proxy for wind and solar and the electricity demand that we experienced during those years, right? So we did the most basic, like hindcast your model to make sure that you don't royally screw up the future, and you get devastating blackouts. So
And just to be clear for the
Yeah,
people who are listening, 8760, that's the number of hours in a year. So you
yeah.
looked at the number of hours at 24 hours times 365 is 8,760. So you used your model to hindcast what the impact of these rules would be. And what did you find?
Blackouts, big old blackouts all along the mid-continent independent systems operator. So I forget what year it was, historical comparison year, right? So when we go 2019 weather, 2020, 21, or 22, but at one point we had 26 gigawatts of blackout, Robert, which
Right.
is about 20% of the entire demand in MISO. So for reference, 26 gigawatts would be the peak demand for both Minnesota and Wisconsin combined. So just imagine two, fairly decent sized Midwestern states. I know people on the elitists on the coast don't think that we matter, but that's a big deal. And these blackouts inevitably happen in winter because the amount of solar that you have on the grid is just basically worthless during the winter months, especially in the northern regions where, if it doesn't snow before the polar vortex rolls through, which it doesn't always, but sometimes it does, then you still don't. You have short days where you don't have a lot of coincident demand, right? And this is only going to get worse as we are forced to give up our gas furnaces and go to heat pumps or electric resistance heat, right? So when you look at let's just look at Winter Storm Elliott, right? Like we had blackouts along the southeast because there's a high use of electric heat for home heating, right? It
Right.
just
Right.
doesn't pay to run the gas infrastructure to the houses as much. So during the periods when you need the power the most, the solar is just mathematically, physically incapable of helping you meet that demand. So as we move forward, Mitch and I are a lot more concerned about future winter blackouts than we are in the summer, right? Plus the consequences are worse.
Well, and that's a key point because we're seeing the same in Texas, where Texas is becoming a winter peaking grid instead of a summer peaking grid, and because of the demand for electric heat. So, if I'm going to step back for a second, Isaac, and just give you my quick feedback on it. So, at the same time that you mentioned Rocky Mountain Institute, but along with Natural Resources Defense Council, Rewiring America, Sierra Club, the rest of these groups that are getting hundreds of millions of dollars from some of the richest people in the world to push the electrify everything effort that is going to add more peak winter demand. That at the same time, the EPA is trying to implement rules that will make the grid even less available or less reliable during those critical points. Am I missing something?
We're burning the reliability candle at both ends, Robert.
I like the way you put that. That's good. So explain
Jot
what
that down. You can use
at
that
both.
one in the
I'm
future.
writing it. I am.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well. So I like that image. Explain what you mean by it.
Right. So we're simultaneously reducing the amount of dispatchable, reliable capacity on the grid through EPA regulations while simultaneously demanding more from a system that is being starved of dispatchable capacity. Right. Like it's not rocket science. Like supply must always meet demand with electricity. Otherwise, you have rolling blackouts. And demand response is not a real solution. Demand response is the opposite of Motel 6. We turn the lights off on you. Write that one down.
But
So
I like that. I think that's a key phrase as well, the starved of dispatchable capacity, because this is something too that I think is one of the reasons I wanted to have you back on. FERC and NERC and the RTOs have been repeatedly warning about this. They've been saying over and over and over, we're losing too much dispatchable capacity, too much thermal generation, and relying too much on intermittent weather dependent sources, and that the grid. NERC has put this in their same report, I think, every year for the last 3 or 4 years. The grid is being characterized by one that is more vulnerable to extreme temperatures and wind and solar droughts. And my readback would be, wait a minute, if we're facing more extreme weather because of climate change, why would we make the grid more dependent on the weather? But it makes no sense to me at all. But starved for dispatchable capacity. So do you have some estimates on how much thermal capacity in MISO might be retired?
yeah, we've been doing some work for the North Dakota Transmission Authority on the amount of on the MATS rules. So that
Yeah.
would affect the lignite power plants. And we're
So
looking at
sorry, Mats, forgive me.
mercury and air toxics.
This is again a federal rule on air pollution, right? Okay.
Yes, essentially, I mean, the Biden administration is pulling out all the stops to ladle as many regulations on coal plants as possible, and hoping that if one rule is not, going to be upheld, that something else will get them, right? It's basically the Gina McCarthy, Obama era, um, tactic of, we'll throw so much stuff at them, plant owners will just decide it's not worth investing in this stuff, and we're just going to starve the market from capital, and rather than retrofit, they're going to retire. So,
and in doing so, they create political uncertainty, right?
Yes, that's the point.
Which is a real problem for anyone trying to deploy capital. And if you recall, then just in the last few days in Dubai, John Kerry said that the U.S. is pledging to close all of its coal plants. I mean, this is a dramatic move, particularly when just a few days ago, and I wrote about this on my Substack, that PJM warned specifically about the closure of a coal plant in Maryland, saying it was going to cause significant reliability problems if that one coal plant closed. Well, imagine if we close all of them. I mean, what impact would that have? I think it could be very serious, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. 100%, Robert. So we've got about 55 gigawatts of coal on the MISO system, and just the announced retirements from the EIA database and integrated resource plans is going to bring that down to the high 30s, right? So at a time when MISO only has a capacity surplus, and I put scare quotes around that because I don't necessarily know if I believe that capacity surplus of 1,500 megawatts, and they're projecting that they could have 9.6 gigawatts of capacity shortfalls by the 28-29 planning year. We're in a reliability hole, and we need to stop digging. That means you keep every single thermal unit that you have on your system. I don't care if it's coal, I don't care if it's nuclear, but letting that shut down is malpractice for any grid manager, in my opinion. So like that's just the way that we're going. But EPA wants to, obviously shut all that stuff down because they know they can't get anything through Congress. And, it was Obama that said there's more than one way to skin a cat. So it's essentially rule by regulator, or, if you want to be inflammatory about it, it's rule by swamp, right? The administrative state is trying to enact what Congress will not do. And, that inaction on Congress is actually a great thing, because what EPA is trying to do doesn't work with the physics of the way the grid works. And, just to get back to this EPA regulation, and I want to clarify what the cost is, right? So when Mitch and I were looking at this rule, we wanted to isolate the true cost of the regulation for the MISO system. So we said, how much additional wind, solar, and battery storage would you need to build on this MISO grid of the future that EPA has in order to not have these blackouts? Because having a grid where 20% of your demand cannot be met is not a rational basis for rulemaking, right? So the $246 billion is only the extra capacity that we would need in order to prevent those blackouts. It's not the total cost from today, right? So that's a little bit of a departure from the way that we normally model things. We normally say, this is the grid we have, and this is what it would cost to build, to double the size of the grid. So but in this instance, we really wanted to narrowly focus it on the impact of the EPA's regulation. Like if you're gonna prevent blackouts and meet EPA's CO2 reduction targets, this is the additional cost that would be there, and that's how we were able to show that the cost of this rule in MISO alone would exceed the expected benefits for the entire country.
Well, and that's that was another good point that you made, that you said that 246 billion exceeds the EPA's total modeled benefits of 5.9 billion annually for the entire nation. So what is that? 6 into 246? What is that? A factor of 60, something like that. So the cost of the regulation in MISO alone is 60x what the potential benefits are in nationwide. And I just looked it up, so I want to make sure people understand what MISO is. So the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, it manages the flow, I'm reading from their website, of high voltage electricity across 15 states and the Canadian province of Manitoba. 45 million people depend on MISO. So we'll call it 50 million. Well, this is only 1/6 of the country here. So I'm saying only in quotes, but $250 billion for 1/6 of the country, or, this is the cost here potentially nationwide. Then if you extrapolate that out, we're costing, a trillion and a half. I mean, how long is a piece of string? We don't know. right? But all of this is contingent again on a massive build out of stuff when it's hard to build anything at scale in the United States. And that's the part where the physical reality of the world seems to be colliding just at full speed with all of these spreadsheet jockeys who are saying, oh, we'll just do this. And Jesse Jenkins is one of the spreadsheet jockeys. Oh, we'll just build all this stuff and we'll add all of this high voltage transmission. We'll go slowly and tell me how you're going to do all this because I'm from Oklahoma. I'm a little stupid. How to it? But that seems to be the case in all of this, is this collision between the theory and the spreadsheet and the reality of how the grid works. You talked about this earlier. Why is there such a big gap? Why is there such a big gap between the physical world and what is all this policy stuff that's being generated both by academics, by NGOs, and by the government?
What's the old Reagan quote? Conservatives believe it when they see it, and liberals see it when they believe it. But I think that's it. This is the world that they want to exist. So they're willing to hand wave away a whole litany of very real consequences, right? So they pretend that, like, oh, well, the costs will the benefits will outweigh the costs in the long run. When realistically, like, even by their own social cost of carbon metrics, like, doesn't make sense to do this. They have to keep goosing those numbers. Robert Pilkey Jr. had a post about that recently on his Substack, right? So the administrative state will always find a way to manipulate their cost benefit analysis in order to do what they want to do. And that's what people like Jesse Jenkins are paid the big bucks to figure out. So, but it's all BS, right? So you have kind of this, I don't want to call them elite because I don't feel like they're elite. They just happen to have a lot of money and like institutional backing and stuff like that. So they dictate to us yokels, us country folk, Robert, how we're going to live our lives. But really, like, if they ever been out to where you've been and touched grass, they'd realize, well, maybe this what we're proposing isn't very realistic.
Well, isn't that, it's something. I was in Kearney, Nebraska recently, and I spoke to the Nebraska Rural Electric Association. It was on the same day that the COP meeting started in Dubai. And I thought that morning I was talking to a guy who manages a public power district in northeastern Nebraska. And I thought, I'm probably the furthest away from that place. The people that are there, that are in Nebraska, they're as culturally and politically, they're as far away as they could possibly be from the climateers, the climate people in Dubai. But this is one of the key divides, isn't it? Between the urban and the rural. You're a rural guy, right? You grew up on a farm in Wisconsin, on a dairy farm. How do you see it? Now you live in the city now, but how do you see that divide? Is it getting worse? Is it how important is it?
So I have a theory, right? Once your family is 3 generations removed from using an outhouse, you don't really understand the way the world works anymore, right?
Hmm.
So people think food comes from the store. They think electricity comes from the outlet, and they don't really appreciate all of the work that goes into manifesting the modernity that we all enjoy, right? So I think that it's rational, right? Not everybody checks their electric bill because they can pay for it, right? So I'm not saying that it's like people have some moral failing or anything like that, but if we continue to pursue the policies that have been laid out, mostly by Democrats, right, then they are going to be reacquainted with scarcity in a way that they are not anticipating, right? Because a lot of these people have been told is we're going to go green, it's going to be cheaper, it's going to be cleaner, it's going to be better. And I think Europe is starting to figure out, well, maybe these promises, I mean, they're big promises, right? In order to sucker people into something, you gotta let them think that they're gonna have it all and not have to give up very much. And people are willing to give up a lot in order to give up or get a lot. Yeah, it's like everybody dreams about winning the lottery, right?
Yeah, right.
So it's kind of that idea. I think they've been told you will win the energy lottery if we go to wind and solar, and people are still kind of hoping for that payoff. And it's going to take.
But the counter indicator there, though, is that when the surveys are done, and Gallup has done these and others, that in fact, when put to the voters, they're asked, well, how many dollars would you really be willing to spend for zero carbon, low carbon, something, right? And it's something like, the numbers are incredibly low. What 20% of people said they would be even willing to spend $1 or $2 a month. I mean, the number of people who are actually willing to pay money to support these kinds of ideas is very, very small. and
Well,
and
yeah.
it's and it's heavily democratic as well. Remember, almost half of all the electric vehicles sold in America go into just 20 counties in the United States, and all of them are heavily democratic. And I will point out one of them is Travis County, where I live here in Austin. EVs are popular in Democratic counties. In Republican counties, you don't see them. You don't see them in rural Nebraska. You don't see them in rural Iowa. You don't see them in rural Wisconsin or Minnesota. They just don't. People there don't care about them. They don't want them. They drive pickups.
Yeah, and that's why people like Jesse Jenkins get paid the big bucks to tell them that they're not paying more. They basically gaslight the public into saying, well, this isn't wind and solar's fault. It's the interest rates or it's the additional transmission costs that are being built. But let's think about this for a second. You only need the transmission if you're building a lot of new capacity that doesn't work very frequently, and you need to have these huge transfers of electricity across the bulk power system. So, I mean, even Jesse Jenkins' report says what? There's going to be a 2x need for additional transmission capacity if
Right.
we're going to do this Rube Goldberg wind, solar, and battery storage thing. So they say, oh, no, 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 it's the transmission, without thinking like, oh, well, you wouldn't need the transmission if you were replacing coal plants with new nuclear plants, which is what we've been advocating for 6 or 7 years at this point. Like, so nuclear is a plug and play replacement for coal. If you care about reducing emissions, do that. And then like the interest rates, that only affects you if you're building new capacity. Because guess what? If you've paid off your mortgage, the 8% interest rate doesn't matter to you, right? So
Right.
most of the plants that the utilities are shutting down are depreciated assets, which means they're not making a return for their shareholders. So they want to shut them down as quickly as possible and build a whole bunch of new stuff. I mean, your line
Well,
is follow the money.
yeah. Well, let's explore that, because therein lies one of the key differences in the generation fleet in America, right? The co-ops don't have that same interest, right? Their depreciation is not as important to them or the public power guys, right? Because they're owned by their owners, right? They're owned by their customers. So that point you're making about they're in no hurry to close down their coal plants. They wanted that cheap power because that's how they're measured, right? It's not they don't have that accounting benefit of the depreciation. It doesn't matter to them. They want to run those plants into the ground in order to keep the low cost power coming. But is that how important? Have you thought about that? I mean, I know you're looking at the RTO level and the national level, but the differences between, because I talk to a lot of co-ops, I'm all about co-ops, I'm all about public power. That difference between the IOUs and the public power entities, publicly owned power entities, and how their interests differ. Have you thought much about that?
Uh, Only insofar as like the utilities, like let's say in Minnesota, especially Excel Energy, they're the worst offender. They're the ones.
And investor owned utility.
Yep, yep. So the first investor-owned utility to say we're going to be carbon free by 2050, right? So, the utilities used to be run by engineers, and when they did, or they kept costs low and they cared about reliability. Now most of these utilities are run by lawyers and accountants, and all they care about is shutting down depreciated assets and building new stuff. Pad the rate base, right?
Right.
And that's the
and
name of the
and
game.
collect the tax credits while doing so.
Collect the tax credits, pretend you're saving the planet, line your own CEO pockets, give them a big ESG bonus, and who cares about the ratepayer? Because I'm not going to be here in 5 years anyway. But when you have the co-ops, they're a lot more inclined to say, well, we have these assets that we've paid for. So a lot of the co-ops in Minnesota purchased their power from lignite-fired power plants in North Dakota,
Right.
Coal Creek Station being one of them. They tend to care more about it. The property or the co-op that manages the I guess the umbrella organization Great River Energy, they made a big mistake, I think, in my opinion. They wanted to shut down Coal Creek and they ended up selling it so they could purchase from the market, right? And I think that as more dispatchable capacity is retired, you're going to see more wild fluctuations in the wholesale price of electricity like we see in Texas. So I think that Great River Energy's customers, and I'm one of them at my house here, are going to be subject to higher costs because management there wanted to show how green they were by getting rid of their coal plant. So but as a rule, I think you're absolutely right. The rural electric co-ops want to maintain that reliable capacity the stuff that their members have already paid for, and they deserve the dividends of low cost, reliable power as a result.
Well, and just to put, you may know these numbers, but I studied them, so I have them in my head. But there are about 2,000 public power companies, public power utilities in the U.S., including I live in Austin. Austin Energy is one of them. L.A. Power and Water, L.A. Water and Power is one of them. Another one. So 2,000 of those, and around 800 or 900 electric co-ops. And by comparison, investor-owned utilities like XL, there are about 180. But those investor-owned utilities serve about half of the U.S. population. So. But I want to read, since we talked about XL, I think I read this the last time you were on, but I love this, what Ben Folk said in his Senate testimony in 2021. He said, he's talking about XL. He's now retired. He said, by 2030, we estimate renewable energy will make up 2/3 of our energy mix. However, renewables can only take us so far. At higher levels of intermittent renewables, the cost of the energy system begins to skyrocket and its reliability degrades. That means that the whole industry, even XL Energy with our remarkable renewable resources, will need some form of new carbon-free 24/7 dispatchable generation to remove the last increment of emissions on our system and get to zero. He doesn't say the word nuclear there, but that's clearly what he's referring to. And you talk about nuclear in your report. And there's a schism here as well between the Republicans and the Democrats, in that the Republicans seem much more still more open to and supportive of nuclear than Democrats. Has the conversation shifted in Minnesota? I know the battle has been pitched there over the future of nuclear. What are you seeing in your home state?
Oh, no, it hasn't. The
Because the
Republicans are saying,
Democrats dominate
yeah,
the.
yeah. So the Democrats have a trifecta. They got the House, they got the Senate, they got the governor. They passed a 100% carbon-free electricity mandate while explicitly not repealing our moratorium on new nuclear power plants. We talked about this a lot the last time I was on the show, right? The Republicans are saying, hey, let's just put new nuclear power plants at our coal plants. Let's do this smart. And the Democrats basically said no. But like let's not pretend that this is a Republican Democrat problem, right? I mean, Chuck Grassley is the granddaddy of the wind production tax credit. And
Right.
even when Trump was in office and they had the House, the Senate, and President Trump, they still couldn't kill the wind production tax credit, right? And ultimately, that is undermining the reliability of the grid in a big way now, and they need to stop that. I think that they should propose a severance tax on wind and solar. Just throw as much uncertainty into the market as possible, because that's exactly what the administrative state is doing to the dispatchable coal and gas fleet, right? So you got to fight fire with fire. And this idea that like, oh, we're going to play nice and continue to subsidize the energy sources that are depriving dispatchable generators of the revenue they need to stay online, that's a strategy to lose. We need to change tactics here. The production tax credits, the investment tax credit, they need to go 100%. But we'll see what happens.
Well, they were just effectively made permanent under the Inflation Reduction Act, which Travis Fisher has documented, and so has Wood Mackenzie. That in fact, unless the ITC is repealed in the Inflation Reduction Act, ultimately the solar provisions in there could cost $900 billion by 2060. It's an open-ended set of subsidies. But let's talk about Colorado, because I want to compare and contrast the work you've done on MISO with what you did on Colorado. You wrote, and this is another study that you did with Mitch Rawling and someone else from the Independence Institute. Who was that?
Yeah, Jake Fogelman, great guy.
Yeah. Where is he based?
He's at the Independence Institute in Denver.
In Denver. Oh, okay. Right. Okay.
Yep.
So you wrote that you concluded the compliance with the all renewable mandate envisioned by Governor Jared Polis, a Democrat in Colorado, would cost the state $318 billion through 2050, would result in an average cost of $243 per month for the typical Colorado household over the same time frame. $243 a month, that is a big number. I mean, but did your study get much traction in the Colorado press?
Yeah, actually, it got quite a good amount. I mean, more than we would have expected. I would have expected zero, because they're all kind of in the tank for this thing. But,
Right.
the big difference, I guess, go ahead and ask your next question.
Well, no, go ahead, because I want to.
Yeah.
I want to. Your conclusion here kind of is one of the things we've been talking around. But go ahead.
Yeah, so the big difference between what Governor Polis is looking at in Colorado and our EPA modeling is Polis wants to go 100% carbon free using wind, solar, and battery storage. And
Right.
the EPA plan still had a lot of natural gas capacity online, right? So having dispatchable thermal plants really reduces the amount of overbuilding and curtailing that you need to do on your system in order to meet hourly electricity demand, right? So like the more dispatchable capacity, that's why nuclear is so valuable to a grid that's going to be carbon free, because 95% of the time it's probably going to be there. Whereas wind can be operating at 90% of its potential output, or it can be negative 22 during a polar vortex. They shut the wind turbines down and they're actually drawing power from the system, right? So it's really about the value that different generation technologies are providing to the consumer. And wind and solar just aren't very valuable because you can't control when they, are generating, and electricity just so happens to be the service, right, as you say, that needs to have exact balance at every nanosecond, right?
Right.
So, there's a reason why we didn't have a ton of wind and solar on the grid before we started subsidizing them. It's because they're not very good at it.
Right. Well, that when you said that, the value part of this, because I testified before the Senate, now it's a couple of years ago, but I remember very vividly the senator from New Mexico, Martin Heinrich, after I finished, he pulled out this massive poster board that showed levelized cost of energy, right? And saying, well, see, look, solar and wind are cheaper, blah, blah, blah. And then he make sure not to ask me a question, or did not give me the opportunity to respond to it. But that seems to be the big schism, or the big differential here is, oh, well, let's look at the cost. And what you're just underscoring is, what is the value? And I thought if I had that opportunity again, I'd say, yes, Senator, levelized cost. Well, okay, a pup tent, you can call a pup tent housing, but its value as housing over the long term is very, very low. It might work for a night or two, but not for a year. And so that pup tent is I'm making the analogy, the pup tent is the solar and wind, and the nuclear plant is the brick house, right? But I'll ask a question here. So is that this there's so much focus on the cost and not enough focus on the value of these different generation sources? Is that another way to think about this?
Oh, 100%, Robert. So if you look at our Colorado report, we found that meeting Colorado's peak electricity demand using nuclear reactors, right? We're big fans of the APR 1400. Let's just hire a bunch of South Korean firms, come over here, pour big reactors. Like let's not mess around. Let's bring in the experts. And then we also had small modular reactors as our peaking resource, right?
Right.
I don't know that that's the best peaking resource because it's super capital intensive and you're not going to be running it very frequently. But meeting Colorado's peak electricity demand with nuclear power plants and some battery storage would require 14,372 megawatts of installed capacity. Doing that same thing, so meeting Colorado's electricity demand for every hour of the year with wind, solar, and battery storage would require 124,538 megawatts of installed capacity. So just a huge increase in the amount of intermittent, unreliable capacity that you'd need in order to do the same job. So when you're doing that, if you're going to hire 124,000 employees to flip burgers when you only needed 14,000, like you're going to have to pay them a lot, right? So that is why when Mitch and I do our levelized cost of energy analysis, we always add in those additional costs, right? So in our Colorado analysis, we found that if you're ultimately what we need to stop thinking about the cost of generating electricity, and we need to start talking about the cost of serving load. How much does it cost to meet the electricity demand that we have with different energy resources? And when you look at that with wind and solar in Colorado under the Polis plan, we found it would cost $214 a megawatt hour to meet demand with wind, and 302 with solar. The new APR 1400s were like at $67 or something like that, right? Because
Right.
a nuclear plant's going to last 80 years. We're seeing in Minnesota right now, wind turbines are only lasting for 11 or 12 before they're being repowered, right? So,
Right.
um, so the value proposition, like once you add in the additional transmission costs, the property taxes, the utility profits, the rate base that we just got done talking about, and then the overbuilding and curtailment that you need to do on your Rube Goldberg grid, in order to meet that demand, it's way more expensive. And we're seeing that everywhere that it's being, or wind and solar are being tried at scale.
I want to underscore what you just said about what the generation fleet that would be needed with nuclear versus solar and wind. So it's a factor of 9 from 14 gigawatts with nuclear versus 124 gigawatts with wind and solar and batteries, a 9x differential. And when I hear that, I'm thinking, well, 9x in terms of copper, steel, neodymium iron boron magnets, concrete, all of the things that you're going to need to build all that stuff, and then the massive amounts of transmission. It's just this, again, the disconnect between the physical world and the spreadsheet jockeys just seems ever more apparent. I wanted to read this in the conclusion on your Colorado study that you did with Mitch Rawling and Jake
Fogelman.
You wrote, ultimately, the idea behind attempting to power a grid at scale with just wind, solar, existing hydropower, and current battery technology is a profoundly unserious one. It is primarily a reflection of ideological preferences more than any consideration of real-world economic costs and physical constraints. I like the way you put that, and I think that's exactly right. It is unserious, but yet it captivates the public in a way that, somehow this renewable energy fetishism is going to save us from this potentially very disastrous future with regard to climate change. But how have we become so unserious? Is it the same detachment that you talked about from the outhouse to where we are?
I think so, right? And it's the something for nothing fallacy, right? So people have been told for a really long time that this is going to be easy and cheap, and they're willing to try and see that out. That's why we have jobs, Robert, because we're the ones saying, hey, this isn't working. And that paragraph that you just read, that was all Jake Fogelman. I don't want to take credit. He did an excellent job on this report. He did a lot of the verbiage for it. But yeah, I mean, people don't know where their stuff comes from. And when you don't know where that stuff comes from, that allows unserious people, grifters, to get involved in that supply chain and start ladling the benefits into their own pockets. And it just so happens that that's what's happening with the electric grid, which is the most important infrastructure we have. So we're playing stupid games. We're probably going to win some stupid prizes.
Oh, good. So what are you working on now, Isaac? You've obviously been working a lot, and I'm not diminishing the work that you have done. You've done reports on 11 states: Arizona, West Virginia, Colorado, Michigan, Virginia, and a bunch of others. You've looked at the EPA impacts on MISO. You've looked at EV mandates in Colorado. What else are you working on these days?
Yeah, so we are looking at the impact of the mercury and air toxic standards, retiring 6 coal-fired power plants in North Dakota. What impact will that have on grid reliability moving into the future? So that's with the North Dakota Transmission Authority. We're still working on that paper on the material intensity of wind and solar, Robert. We keep promising that that'll come out soon. Hopefully, we're not lying this time. So that's going to be something that we're working on. So Mitch and I still try to get weekly articles out there. We're doing our Substack now, so that's been a lot of fun. So, yeah, I mean, essentially, it's good because every time we finish a project, somebody else says, "Hey, you wanna run the numbers on this for us?" And we say, "Yeah, let's talk about it."
So a reminder on the Substack, you and Mitch are on Substack, energybadboys.substack.com.
That's right.
Okay. Energybadboys.substack.com. Isaac is also on Twitter at the fracking guy. You can also find his work at the americanexperiment.org website. We've been talking for nearly an hour, Isaac, and I know you've got a plane to catch. So maybe in the interest of time, since we've covered a lot of the things that I was hoping we would, let's cut to the last 2 questions, and you know what they are. So what are you reading these days? What's on your bookshelf there in Minneapolis?
Yeah, I'm reading a couple different books. I'm reading Electric Power System Basics for the Non-Professional, second edition. You got to learn so many people don't know the basics of this stuff, myself included.
I should read that one. I haven't. I probably have it on my bookshelf, but I don't know. I just bluff my way through it. But yes, I need to learn my VARs is one of the things I need to learn.
Well, when you started talking about the distribution system being taken out earlier prematurely due to EV charging,
Yeah.
That's when I was like, okay, I need to learn more about the distribution system. So that prompted me to pick this book up. And then
And give us
my
that title again. What is it again? One more
yeah,
time.
yeah, absolutely. It's a page turner. Let me tell you, it's Electric Power System Basics for the Non-Electrical Professional, second edition.
Right.
Um, and then my coworker Peter Zeller, give a shout out to him. He's a big fan of the Power Hungry podcast, so I want him to get
Sure.
his little bump here. He recommended I start reading The Wizard and the Prophet,
Uh-huh.
so I'm reading that right now, and that's been really good.
And that's by Charles Mann, correct? Is that right? Charles Mann, and it's about Norman Borlaug and who was the other one?
William Vogt.
Okay, all right. Or was it
Yeah,
Paul Ehrlich? Or okay,
no,
yeah,
uh, somehow Paul Ehrlich still gets work after being wrong as many times as he has been. But
yeah,
good work if you can get it, I guess. But no, we're big fans of Norman Borlaug at American Experiment, right?
sure.
Like Borlaug went to college at the University of Minnesota. That's the kind of environmentalism that we want to promote as an organization, right? Progress through improvements and basically making things more efficient. That's how you actually make things better. Like we don't want to shrink away from challenges that we face, which is kind of how I feel about the profit side, right? We want to be innovating our way out of problems, not pretending they're intractable and like making our quality of life worse along the way.
And if any of y'all don't know, Borlaug was the father of the Green Revolution. Finished his career at Texas A&M and died about 5 years ago, 6 years ago, something like that. Not too long ago, but that was. But did Borlaug win the Nobel Prize? Am I remembering that correctly, or maybe I'm inventing that? But nevertheless, was a remarkable and pivotal figure in global agriculture. So, final question, Isaac. You know what's coming. What gives you hope?
Uh, Germany is not doing so hot. So,
Wait, so what gives you hope is that Germany's in the ditch? I
the
haven't heard that one.
Schadenfreude of
Uh-huh.
Germany is, yeah, because like they were the darling of the wind and solar folks for a really long time, right? Like you couldn't read any article about green energy without hearing about how smart Germany was and how stupid the United States was. And it's turning into a Shiza show over there. And I'm here for it. So, um,
So the hope is that the world will learn from the mistakes of Germany. If I'm going to paraphrase what you're saying.
yeah. And even if we don't, it's fun to watch it burn.
You crack me up. That's funny. Well, I talk about Germany as well, and my line is: look, if I were a better person, if I were a better Christian, I would feel sorry for them. I don't. I don't feel bad for them at all. They bragged about it. They drove themselves into the ditch. I hope you like it out there. You did it
That's
yourself.
right. That's right. I'm here for the Energy Weimar.
Because the energy venda has been such a disaster.
That's
So
right.
yeah.
Energy Venda to Energy Weimar. I just want people to be pushing wheelbarrows full of solar panels around.
Speaking German all the while and congratulating themselves. Well, listen, Isaac, it's always been a pleasure. It's always a pleasure. My guest, of course, as I've said, is Isaac Orr, my friend. He's a policy fellow at the Center of the American Experiment. You can follow him at americanexperiment.org, on Twitter at the Fracking Guy, and his new Substack with Mitch Rawling, energybadboys.substack.com. Isaac, as always, a pleasure.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's been fun.
And to all of you out there in podcast land, thanks for tuning into this episode of the Power Hungry Podcast. Make sure and tune in to the next one. Until then, see ya.